And this is a way of essentially conjuring up the problematic attachment and then working through it, right? Because again, that is dead, right? You don't have a chance to go back and redo your childhood. But what you do have a chance to do is pull that out of its box and reinterpret it and put it back.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 350. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people just like you. And today I am doing a question and answer episode with two awesome questions from listeners like yourselves. If you would like to send me a question for the show, send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. I am hoping that I'll be able to get through this episode well. My kid, Remy, has been sick for a week now, and he's got this horrendous cough and fever and stuff like that. Poor kiddo. Took him to the doctor finally, got him a chest x-ray and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't think it's anything beyond just whatever's going around right now. But he has been coughing his head off. Actually, tonight's the first night where he's not coughing constantly. So hopefully we're able to make it through the podcast okay. Poor guy, though. He gets like really sort of like desperate and clingy when he's like this. So he'll be like, Dad. I'm like, what, bud? What is it? I love you. Like, I love you too, kiddo. Ugh. It sucks. But amazingly, I've been able to stay fine despite having him like cough in my eyeballs and shit. Oh, kids are lovely. Anyway, I hope that you guys are doing well. It will be Mother's Day in the United States this weekend. And so if you are a mom out there, I appreciate you. I see you, and thank you for your service. I got a bunch of flowers to plant out front for my wife for Mother's Day, and she doesn't listen to the podcast, so she's not going to hear this, but I got her like a giant unicorn squishmallow that she can sleep with as well. So hopefully those are things that will go over well. I'm totally rambling. Let's go ahead and get into the show. Let's start. Oh boy. All right, here we go. First question. It reads, "Hello, doctor. I hope you're doing well. Your podcast has been very helpful, and I was wondering if you could talk about daddy issues, causes, solutions, etc. in your next episode. Thank you very much." So short and sweet, but a really good question, and actually one that I don't believe that I have responded to before. So yeah, I'm happy to get into it. Daddy issues. So the term daddy issues is thrown around a ton. I'm not sure if it's internationally relevant, but certainly here in the US it's thrown around a lot, and it's often thrown around in like a playful manner. But what does it actually mean, and what can you do if you are somebody who has daddy issues? Let's dig into it a little bit. First thing to clarify is that daddy issues is not a term or a diagnosis that you're going to find in the DSM or other medical literature, right? It's not a real thing. I'm saying that in air quotes, right? It's not like a diagnosis. It's not like a disorder that you're going to find out there. And so there's also not one specific definition for it. Even what I'm going to talk about here with regard to, what we call daddy issues, this may be different from how somebody else thinks about them. So just be aware of that. We're not all talking about the same thing necessarily. But in general, it's a phrase that refers to the negative ways in which somebody's relationship with their father during childhood or lack of a relationship, and the way that that impacts them in adulthood, right? So the negative ways in which somebody's relationship with their father in childhood impacts them currently in adulthood. And there are some stereotypes about what people with daddy issues are like, which I will address a little bit later. But let's first talk about sort of what causes somebody to have daddy issues. I feel funny talking about it because it's such a non-clinical term. Like I keep saying daddy issues over and over. But you guys hopefully pick up what I'm putting down. So one obvious source of difficulties that may qualify as daddy issues is when you're raised by a father that is emotionally unavailable, detached, or at the very least, very inconsistent. And while I'm talking about specifically daddy issues here, because that's what was asked about, I do think it's kind of unnecessarily gendered and also focused very, very heavily on Western family structures. So please bear with me if you have, two moms or have never had a male attachment figure in the first place. A lot of this is transferable. It's more about the role that somebody plays in your life rather than their specific gender, I think. So daddy issues is the term I'm going to use, but really that can apply to other things as well. Now, that said, I am going to talk a little bit about, especially within the United States, some things that are related to gender and fatherhood and such. So I think that a lot of men, especially historically, are taught by the media and society to be more stoic and unemotional. The patriarchy basically says that men should be workers in positions of power, and authority should be strong, functional, pragmatic. And therefore, men may have a sense that being emotional is being like soft, which is for one reason or another interpreted as a form of weakness. And then when men like this, who have had that sort of socialization, become fathers, they're in a position where their children are looking to them for models of how to interact in the world. And they never learn the tools to understand how to work with emotions, so they're not able to teach or model them for their child. And as a result, the father may not understand the child's experience or may even lash out, punish the child for having strong emotions since they're not seen as useful. Now, obviously, there's a spectrum here, right? There are some fathers that are just aloof and not emotionally helpful or available. And then there are others who are more directly abusive, and that could be emotionally or physically. There are also some fathers that are just totally preoccupied with work or other priorities they might have, to the detriment of the emotional connection they can have with their child or children. And then, of course, there are some fathers that are just very unexpressive and never say words like, I love you, or you're safe, or I appreciate you, I'm proud of you, things like that, right? So there's that detachment sometimes. And speaking of detachment, these issues can lead to problematic attachment styles. You probably heard a lot about attachment styles before. I've talked about them here a bit, but basically attachment styles are how you learn to interact and rely on caregivers in your early years, and that influences the way that you build relationships later on. At least that's the theory. And a lot of times when you have situations like this where you have, this emotional unavailability or abusiveness or disconnection, that can lead to insecure attachment styles. And those fall into basically three categories. So you have the anxious, preoccupied attachment style. And that's when you want to be close to others, but you're really terrified of being rejected or left or abandoned. So as a result, you become more demanding and more dependent, sometimes kind of needy or something like that. So anxious, preoccupied, you're always worried about being left. So you try to compensate for that by clinging very close. Then you have the fearful avoidant attachment style, which is where you can form intimate relationships, but you don't trust them because you know that you're always vulnerable. You might get hurt. So you're always, sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And this leads to being distant and detached. And then the last one is the dismissive avoidant attachment style, which is where you prefer to just avoid making close relationships because you know that that puts you in a position where you're vulnerable and it may be emotionally challenging for you. So you sort of just are dismissive of that. So those are all some of the different attachment styles. I wouldn't write those into stone. There are different theories of it, and attachment styles are not as, sort of clear and cut as we often like to think they are. There's a lot of, buzzwords attached to it, but it's a good sort of way to start conceptualizing the ways in which somebody having a problematic relationship of some kind with their father can lead to problems down the line in terms of the relationships. So, for instance, somebody down the line as an adult with daddy issues might find that they have trouble forming secure attachments in their romantic relationships, and to some extent as well with their, friendly relationships or collegial relationships. they can struggle with things like trust and intimacy and vulnerability. And there's also a theory that people will act in ways that are meant to compensate for the lack of what they received as a child. So they may act in ways that are, say, heavily validation seeking if they never felt validated as a child, right? They might try to really, really seek reassurance and things of that sort if they were never given that as a kid. As well, people with problematic attachments to their fathers may find themselves having patterns of unhealthy relationships. So, for instance, being drawn into emotionally unavailable relationships or recreating patterns from the past. And this may or may not be conscious because we all have mental models of relationships and what they should look like that are informed by the things we see as a child, including our parents or whoever were caregivers for us. Sometimes it's more overt and very obvious, and sometimes it can be subtle, and it's difficult to notice until somebody from the outside points it out. I'm going to talk more about this, but quickly I want to take a little break and talk about today's sponsor, which is MindBloom. Okay, so I am very pleased that we are continuing to partner with MindBloom. I know that a lot of you guys out there listening struggle with things like anxiety and depression. That's part of the reason why you might listen to this show. And there's no quick fix for anxiety and depression. You know, there are tools like therapy, medications, lifestyle changes, and sometimes none of that is doing the trick. Sometimes it's not about having more meditation or a better diet or finding a new therapist. Sometimes you need something different to unlock your brain and think about the world in a different way. And so one of the ways to do that is through guided ketamine therapy from MindBloom. MindBloom is a tool that's here to help you improve your mental health with at-home ketamine therapy. MindBloom is the leader in at-home ketamine therapy, having safely helped thousands of people overcome their anxiety and depression. Unlike traditional talk therapy, ketamine works very quickly and doesn't have unpleasant side effects like traditional antidepressants. In a study of over 1,200 MindBloom clients, 89% reported improvements in their anxiety and depression after only 2 sessions, which is very quick. Right now, MindBloom is offering our listeners $100 off your first 6-session program when you sign up at mindbloom.com/Duff and use the promo code Duff. So take your first step, break free from your anxiety and depression with MindBloom, mindbloom.com/Duff, and use the promo code Duff. Okay, so continuing on with the question, there's another theory that we tend to repeat issues that are unresolved from our past. So we may compulsively and repetitively seek out relationships that mirror the dynamics from the past with our father or other caregivers because we unconsciously want to gain some control over them or resolve them. As well, at a certain level, there's simply comfort in the familiar. If it's what you've always known, having a different experience can be scary or uncomfortable. And I've certainly experienced this in my personal life. I've seen it in others. Somebody who has had an emotionally absent parent or a history of abusive relationships might feel really off-kilter or even scared by somebody treating them with respect and consideration. So it's simpler and more comfortable to just keep gravitating toward the same types of people, even if that is something that brings you pain. If you take a look, there are actually some data to back up these claims. It's been shown that children raised without their father or children that have had a poor relationship with them often have difficulty forming healthy relationships in adulthood, and that they are more likely to experience mental health issues like depression or anxiety and low self-esteem. So there are data out there that support this. Obviously, you can have a look at the research and, take them with a grain of salt because no research is perfect, but there are some data that do back up these claims that I'm making here. As I mentioned, there's also some stereotypes about people who have daddy issues. So some of the things you'll hear are, for instance, they're attracted to older men. They might need constant reassurance from their partner in that sort of, needy way. Maybe they engage in risky sexual behavior as a way to obtain affection and love. They might struggle to maintain healthy boundaries in a relationship. They could be people-pleasing and really, really focused on idealizing their partner. And then there's the sexual stuff, calling partners daddy in bed or in public, being into age play, things like that. Now, those aren't necessarily all problems, but just to paint a picture, that's often what people are talking about or picturing when they say daddy issues. So that's sort of where it comes from and some info about it. But what can you do if this is something that you feel like is a problem for you? I think a huge part of the equation is just self-awareness. Simply understanding that you have certain patterns in your preferences and in your relationships that are probably related to your upbringing and relationship with your father is extremely powerful. Just that knowledge. And this awareness can come from a variety of places, such as reading or listening to educational materials about this subject, such as, learning about attachment, learning about, fatherhood, if there are specific books about daddy issues, etc. Just learning more. It can come from self-reflection, journaling, any way that you're getting your thoughts out. And of course, from getting feedback from people. It's a lot easier to notice these things from the outside than it is from the inside. So having trusted people that can give you that feedback. These are all ways of building that awareness and that self-understanding. If you consider yourself to be somebody who has daddy issues, it's time to go get a notebook, right? And I would start to write down your current and past relationships, as well as what you know about your upbringing. And look for patterns there. Look for patterns that are continuing to be played out. How did your parents raise you? Another really good question is how did your dad's dad raise him, if he had one, right? What was your parents' upbringing like? Also very valuable information. And the whole kind of searching here and building the awareness of the situation is not necessarily to excuse anything in particular, but it's to just understand the lay of the land better, and that gives you power. I'll also say that a lot of times there is a mourning process or a grieving process that also needs to happen. Because whether or not your dad is dead, sometimes playing out the same patterns in different relationships is a way of keeping the spark of that relationship with your father alive, a little bit of a hope there. And that hope is basically the hope or the wish that you had a father that was different, the one that you didn't get to have. And that's not how it works. What's done is done. And maybe in the future, you can have a relationship with him if he's still around. Maybe things can get better. He can do better and make you feel supported. But the version of your childhood where you had this emotionally in tune father, where you felt safe, that's dead. That's gone. That never got to happen. And you're allowed to mourn and grieve that, which can come with all sorts of different feelings. It can come with anger. It can come with fear. It can come with sorrow. There's all sorts of things, and all of those are valid. But you do sort of have to let that go and let that version of childhood that you did not get to have die, and focus more on what do you have now. Now, I will say that people get a lot of flack for things that I talked about before, like age play, forms of BDSM that touch on the themes we've been talking about, like parental roles, discipline, even simply calling a partner daddy. Now, there are certainly circumstances where these things like BDSM, age play, etc., they can be done in an unhealthy way or an exploitative way. But there's also a lot of power in reclaiming part of your experience and using it as a platform to process. And if you talk to people who are in the BDSM scene, a lot of people will talk about that it is, whether consciously, and very intentionally, or more subconsciously, a great way to process things like trauma. And again, there's some research to support this. There are studies that have shown people with a history of childhood sexual abuse may actually experience favorable emotional outcomes when participating in BDSM relationships. I think it's important to not overgeneralize, right? That's not going to be the panacea for everybody. And certainly there are a lot of things involved in BDSM, age play, etc., that need to be figured out, negotiated, done safely, etc. But this is something that on a case-by-case basis, it's important not to just write off, because it could be a helpful tool in healing and in reclaiming. There's this concept of what we call corrective emotional experiences. And it's basically like an emotional redo of some aspect of your past, which allows you to move forward from it and heal from it. So for example, let's say that somebody has been abused or was made to feel unsafe with their father. They may find healing by having a relationship with a man that instead makes them feel safe and cared for. And you may see some similarities there. You may see physical attributes or career things, other types of aspects of the person that may sort of conjure, visions of their father. It's not going to be like a one-to-one thing in most cases, but there might be some similarities. And this is a way of essentially conjuring up the problematic attachment and then working through it, right? Because again, that is dead, right? You don't have a chance to go back and redo your childhood. But what you do have a chance to do is pull that out of its box and reinterpret it and put it back, right? So it can look different ways. That might mean an active effort to stop from falling into the same relational patterns, or it may take giving somebody a chance when you might not otherwise do so. For example, let's say that your dad was an emotionally abusive alcoholic. He also happened to be a biker, and he was part of a biking club. Now, motorcycle club, biking club, MC, you know what I mean. On one hand, you may find yourself gravitating toward people of a similar background, but you also might find yourself avoiding bikers entirely due to this sort of overgeneralization. And in this case, if you were overgeneralizing and just writing off an entire group of people, you may have a corrective emotional experience by dating a biker that does treat you well, that does have a degree of emotional intelligence and makes you feel safe. Basically proving your old schema wrong and giving yourself the opportunity to do that. Now, this does not mean figure out what's wrong and do the exact opposite indiscriminately, right? Because everybody is different. Sometimes being in relationships that look similar to what you've been through in the past is a good idea, sometimes it's a bad idea. We're talking about individuals here. So don't just take this as sort of a blanket approach. But having the opportunity to trust, to build intimacy, to build safety in a secure attachment, that's the sort of thing that can help you move through and past what we might call as, daddy issues. Obviously, therapy is a great resource here. I think there's no better place to safely dive into your upbringing and your history. And through therapy, you might also be able to establish some good techniques for self-regulation and communication within a relationship, and that's going to help you to make better decisions. What I mean by that is sometimes when our bodies are elevated or we're having trouble expressing ourselves, we do things that we later on regret. And so giving you those tools ahead of time and being prepared for things that might come up given the history that you have and the patterns you have, that will allow you to make better decisions. So therapy, very useful here. And that's kind of what I have to say about this. Hopefully these thoughts, clear things up a little bit. Daddy issues are not one specific type of difficulty, but there are some general themes and ways to move forward that we addressed here. So hopefully that's helpful. Take care. All right, and let's roll on to question number 2. It reads, "Hi, Mr. Duff. I've been listening to your podcast for a few years, and it's a great help. Thank you. Though it's my first time writing in." Hey, thanks for writing in. "I've been struggling with really bad social anxiety for many years. It's reached the point where I feel like I start to dissociate whenever people talk to me. I've come to terms with my social circle being as limited as possible, but the dissociation keeps causing me to make really bad decisions in all sorts of unavoidable situations. I just react automatically in any conversation, and this automatic reaction is often trying to end the conversation and get away at any price. It gets me into so much trouble in daily interactions, and I don't know how to stop it from happening. I've been through the conventional treatments for social anxiety, years of CBT and exposure therapy, many SSRI medications, and group therapy. None of those were of any help, and it's all people talk about. Is there anything else that can be done, or will this be my life forever?" Okay, well, thank you for writing in. It sounds like a frustrating situation for you, and I'm sorry that you're, having to deal with this for so long. I think first it's important to note a couple things right off the top here. Firstly, it is true that the most commonly talked about approaches such as CBT aren't going to be effective for everybody in every situation. It's not the panacea, it's not the cure-all. However, I also think we need to consider the fact that the provider that is doing the therapy matters a whole lot. In fact, there's some research that demonstrates that the match between the patient and therapist, in terms of just how well they get along, as well as the patient's expectations for therapy and the level of skill the therapists have, that may matter a whole lot more than the specific techniques that are used. There's this idea of sort of the master therapist model where you can start from whatever theoretical orientation you start with, but as you get better and better, these things converge. And at a certain level, being a great therapist is just being a great therapist. I often make the analogy to food. So if you had tried, say, Thai food or Indian food once, and you didn't really have a good experience, you didn't like it, you wouldn't necessarily write off all Thai food, right? I hope not. Because there are other dishes and other chefs out there that you might totally vibe with. It may have just been this bad experience. That is to say, I would ask that you don't just write off CBT or exposure work, etc. entirely. Nothing is a cure-all, but there may be elements of it that are very helpful to you in the future. But totally valid to be looking into other directions. So let me talk about some. One type of treatment you might look into is what's called psychodynamic treatment or psychoanalytic treatment. A lot of CBT work can be really, really focused on the here and the now. What happened? How did you feel about it? Why? Very action-oriented and solution-focused. Just, the immediacy. And one area of weakness for just straight CBT work is the lack of focus on the history. I wonder if the issue here is that you need to dive deeper. Not to just challenge your assumptions about what other people think of you, but ask yourself what the origins of these insecurities are. For example, I've worked with multiple people who have had issues with frequent dissociation or social anxiety. And once we've worked together for long enough and actually dug in there and gotten a bit deep, it becomes apparent that that was at least partially due to them not being able to live authentically. In some cases, this is related to gender or sexuality, where you're literally living a lie, and so it feels not real to be living. Other issues where people are just sort of living a life that they hate and pretending that they're totally fine and satisfied. So living inauthentically sometimes is at the root of this sort of behavior. And these realizations are only possible when you find somebody that you can really trust in therapy, and when you're encouraged to dive deeper than just these surface level issues. I also wonder if you've ever looked into whether the social anxiety might stem from another issue. So for instance, autism. I know there are a lot of people who are on the spectrum that are misdiagnosed because their particular issues look like OCD or social anxiety, right? Take somebody with autism and they may have repetitive behaviors that look like compulsions from OCD, or stereotyped interests, meaning, a specific thing they're really into that may look obsessive. People with autism also can have, sensory issues where they are very overloaded in social situations. And obviously social cues are something that is different in how they would experience it versus a neurotypical person. And so these issues can look a lot like social anxiety or something else. It might take some advocating for yourself and local research, but if you think this could be a possibility, I would highly encourage you to go find an evaluation. It's something that you're not going to be able to self-diagnose. It's not something that your friends are going to be able to diagnose for you. There are evaluations out there. You just got to kind of do some searching and, as I said, maybe some advocating for yourself. Aside from that, another therapeutic strategy that you may find some success with is what's called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And ACT focuses on helping you to develop what we call psychological flexibility. This is the ability to experience and accept your thoughts and emotions while also moving toward your goals and values. So that may sound similar to mindfulness, and there is a lot of that in there. And maybe you've already done some of this work, things like the exposure work you've done. I'm guessing you've dipped your toe into meditation and mindfulness. But one of the differences with ACT is sort of the spirit of the approach, which would have you connect more with your values and your goals. So it's not just about mitigating symptoms and, achieving these immediate goals. It's about figuring out what your why is and approaching a life that you want to live. So it's a different feel to it. And if you have somebody who is very well versed in ACT, you might find that it is refreshing and it's not just kind of nuts and bolts like CBT can be. Physical health is another thing to consider. So, for example, thyroid issues or blood pressure issues can cause you to have these really strong bodily reactions in a social situation, which then becomes a prompt for anxiety or dissociation. In fact, a lot of people are actually prescribed blood pressure medication, such as propranolol, for things like performance anxiety, because it helps to reduce the impact of your blood pressure changes and physiological changes that can happen when you become embarrassed or nervous or something of that sort. In terms of interactions with people, I think there's nothing wrong with having a small circle of friends, but if it's bugging you because you want to be able to be more gregarious, to interact with more people, that's totally valid. In approaching people, one strategy that you might try, even before sort of solving the social anxiety, is just radical honesty. Simply telling people what's going on. And I mean, you can tell people that if you go blank, doesn't mean you hate them, you just dissociate a lot. I think that we talk about these topics enough in daily life where, you're not going to be completely losing people if you were to talk about that. And in a sort of counterintuitive way, bringing it up can make you feel a lot more comfortable because it's out there and people know how to interpret your behavior, right? So if you're in a group of people and someone asks you a question and they realize you're not paying attention, they're like, "Hey, bud, did you hear me?" You can be like, "Oh my God, sorry. Yeah, I kind of dissociate a lot because I have social anxiety. I'm working on it. I don't hate you. Can you tell me again?" Or something like that, right? So just being very, very honest about it. Just like panic, I think that sometimes dissociation and social anxiety are more like secondary reactions. It's not necessarily the threat of the social situation that causes us problems. It's the potential that we're going to have anxiety, right? You're worried about the fact that you might have anxiety, or worried about the fact that you might disconnect. And that's kind of where that exposure part comes in, right? To show you that you can survive it. It's going to be okay. It's not going to be the end of your social career. But as we talked about, there's more than that. It's not just all about exposure, but that can still be a part of it. So if we can find a way to reduce the intensity enough for you to ride out that initial rush of anxiety or dissociation, we might be able to see some progress in sticking with social activities rather than avoiding them. I think that with exposure work, you said that you tried it, didn't really help at all. This is another area where I would advise you to be careful about generalizing, because a lot of people that say they do exposure work, meaning therapists, actually really suck at it. So I would advise you, if you do want to approach that again, find somebody who's specialized and knows what the hell they're doing. Because, as I said, a lot of people, even, CBT therapists, they don't know the first thing about actually working through an exposure hierarchy, when to move on, the kind of, nitty gritty of it. Two things that are very, very commonly sort of misdone, I guess, is duration. So having people do exposure exercises that are not long. So if you just, go into a coffee shop and say hi to the barista and say a couple things, that does not count as an exposure exercise. I mean, it is, but it's not an effective one. An effective one is where you sit and you talk with somebody, or you do something that causes anxiety for long enough, meaning like 20, 30 plus minutes, long enough for your anxiety to peak and then come back down, because your body will physiologically regulate itself. So that's one thing. And then frequency. A lot of people have trouble with exposure stuff because they maybe start too high on their hierarchy, then they get scared and back off, or they only do it every so often. This should be something that is very systematic and done, consistently. So doing it frequently, doing it for long periods. Those are a couple things among others that a lot of people get wrong about exposure. If you want to learn more about all that, I still have my online course that you could check out, kickanxietycourse.com. I have a whole section on exposure work, leading you through how to do an exposure hierarchy, all the stuff that you would need to know to do it yourself. But yeah, that's kind of what I have to say here as well. I think that it's a really, really great question, and I hope that these thoughts are helpful to you. I appreciate that you're still trying to find ways to make progress, despite having some limited success so far. I believe in you. I think you got this, and I appreciate the question. And with that, this has been episode 350 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you would like to send me a question for the show, send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. You can check out the show notes for this episode at duffthepsych.com/episode 350. And you take good care of yourselves. I'll see you for the next episode. Bye.